Lord, why do you allow such suffering? And that was when he got this message very clearly, right? That what are life and death but relativities in the cosmic dream, and that what you're seeing play out. He uses a specific word, and I honestly didn't know what this word meant, so I had to look it up. He says what you're seeing play out in France, right, which is where the most of the killing in the Western Front, right, in World War I was, is a play of chiaroscuro, and that's an Italian word. I had to look it up, and it actually is a type of artwork that is about shadow and light, right? And he said basically he got this message that the world is like a movie. Hello, everyone. This is Rizwan Virk, and I'm on Your Superior Self.
Rizwan, absolutely fell in love with your book, Wisdom of a Yogi. And I don't know if there's some type of deep ties that I have with Yogananda or not. Uh, just stumbled upon his work maybe a year ago and really started diving into his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, and then was presented with your book. And I was like, heck yes, I definitely want to talk to this guy, right? But first off, let's give some context, right? Some people may not know that you've written a book about the famous guru out not from LA, but who resided in LA and did a lot of his work out there. But give us some context about your background and how you were raised in Western culture and how you received your degrees and professional experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my background is as a computer scientist and as an entrepreneur. I was born in Pakistan near the city of Lahore, where Yogananda's family lived for a period of time when he was just a baby. But I came over to the U.S. relatively young. I was like 4 years old at the time. So pretty much, I was raised in the Midwest. And I ended up going to school at MIT in Boston for computer science. And so, professionally, that's the track that I was on. And I started a few software companies. And over time, I got involved in the video game industry, created one of the number one games in the App Store, for Apple's App Store. And so then became an investor and advisor to a number of startups in Silicon Valley. And I've taught back at MIT. And I wrote a book called The Simulation Hypothesis a few years ago, which was around the idea that reality itself is like a video game, and tying it to both quantum physics and to spiritual ideas, where I hit on many parallels, with Yogananda. But even during the years that I was an entrepreneur, I was kind of living a double life, right? During the day, I'd be dealing with technology stuff and venture capital, business types of things, and technical issues and cloud servers. And then, at night and on the weekends, I'd be jetting off to places to try out different, consciousness related either technologies or experiences. Like I went to the Monroe Institute, which is a place where people do out of body experiences, shamanic dreaming, lucid dreaming, a number of these different experiences. And I was introduced to Yogananda's book, way back in the 90s when I was doing my first startup. And I fell in love with it, as many Americans have. Like, I think it's an introduction to Eastern spirituality for, millions of Americans and for an entire generation back in the 60s and 70s. And, I'm kind of the Gen X, generation or vintage, if you will. And so, the book was Autobiography of a Yogi was one of the most passed around books of the boomer generation in the 60s and 70s. George Harrison used to give away, copies of it everywhere he went to people. Steve Jobs, it was his favorite book. And so that generation kind of passed it down to my generation. And I believe today it's not quite as well known within the younger generations. And so, part of the goal of this book was to try to introduce some of the great stories that he tells of miracles in the Himalayas and gurus, to a new generation, but also to extract lessons for modern seekers today.
Sure. 14 lessons, correct? 14 chapters, 14 lessons in your book.
Yeah, that's right. There's
It's so
14
funny
lessons.
because like I read Yogananda's book the first time and never really grasped the concepts that you talk about in your book. I'm so glad that I actually picked up your book, because now that I look back on it with a second eye, like it totally makes sense now. Some of the concepts that you point out, I was like totally blown away. The teachings, and like lesson number one, you don't need to go to the Himalayas, right? Because like we can do those types of things here, as far as exploring our consciousness and researching, spirituality, or exploring our own spirituality. I think that's a huge concept. I mean, I feel like for the most part of my spirituality right now, like it's always, I always tell my wife, I'm like, if anything happens to us, right, like I am totally going into isolation. Like I tell her that all the time. And then like after reading your book, right, like, and some of the lessons in that first chapter is like, you don't need to go in isolation, really. It's like, there's so many points in that first chapter. It's like, just really hit home with me and resonated, because it's like, you can get up early in the morning and go into you sit on your couch in the living room, and that can be your Himalayas essentially, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yogananda's book was so successful because of the stories he told, and they were very colorful stories. And I mentioned some of the stories about the miracles. We can talk about that later. But in his own life, he was always trying to run off to the Himalayas when he was a little kid, right? And of course, his parents, or his father, because his mom died when he was pretty young, his father and his older brother would always say, "No, no, you're too young to run away." They'd literally chase him. In some cases, they had to chase him across trains because he was trying to go to the yogis in the Himalayas. And eventually he learned that wherever he had room to meditate was like his cave in the Himalayas, and that he wasn't necessarily going to learn from a mountain. And it turns out the guru that he found was only a few miles away from Calcutta, where he grew up, rather than being way up there. And he learned, all of these techniques. And, this is something that's echoed in modern times. I mentioned Steve Jobs. He went all the way to India looking for spirituality. And what he found in the dorm room, or the hostel room that he was staying in, was somebody had left a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi, right, which was published in America. So he went and read that book and reread it every year. And then when he was in his kind of last few years, his biographer showed it was the only book on his iPad at that point in time. And at his funeral, or his memorial service after his funeral, everybody got a little brown box, and when you open the brown box, it had a copy of this book in there. And so many people remember the stories from Yogananda's book, but they may or may not be grasping the lessons, and that's because the stories are so great to read. But you have to kind of think through, okay, what's going on? And so in this case, the lesson is not just from one story. There's like 4 or 5 stories where Yogananda keeps trying to run away, right? And that's where he learns that. And for much of his life, all he had was a little bit of room in an attic, or when he came to the US, anywhere where he could find to meditate. And that was where his spiritual practice was done. And for many of us as well, we think we have to go far away. Well, for me, I was looking for some type of Eastern spirituality. And turns out the startup that I joined right after MIT had a little meditation studio next to it. And that was part of a group run by, kind of this American tall white guy with blonde hair who introduced me, right? Even though I was born in that part of the world, introduced me, to Autobiography of a Yogi and many of the concepts there. So I think it's an important lesson that we should start, where we are, and that there is quite a bit here, wherever you are in America, or really in any other country.
Sure. Absolutely. I agree with that 100%. So 2 questions here, right? Um, was there an event in your life that kind of catalyzed your spirituality or seeking, or was it the book of Yogananda's that kind of fed into that curiosity? And then 2, is Yogananda's book still relevant today?
Well, in the first, for the first question, I mean, there's no one answer, but I've had many experiences over the years that, really got me more interested in this stuff. I'll admit that, like many Westerners, I turned to this initially thinking, to Eastern methods of yoga and meditation, thinking, okay, how can this help me, right? And today, yoga has been stripped of its kind of spiritual significance here in the West, and we see yoga studios everywhere. And we know that it's a healthy practice. It actually makes your body more efficient. But it does more than that on the spiritual levels. And we can talk about this in a minute when we get to what is the definition of yoga. But, my thinking was, as an entrepreneur, hey, if I can do these meditation techniques, if I can do these pranayama or breathing techniques, and they can help me with my concentration, I can write better computer programs. I can deal with the stress of running my company, and I can get rich faster, right? That was sort of my original thinking. But then the more you get into these stories, whether it's Yogananda's book, where he talks a lot about karma, karmic concepts, and you learn that yoga isn't necessarily defined as the physical asanas. That's just one of the 8 limbs of yoga. But so the more you get into it, the more you realize that the world itself, is a kind of dream. And this is where there's overlap between the simulation books that I've written and these, and that the goal of yoga is really to quiet the mind so that you can start to perceive some of what's going on. And so, I read a lot of books like Yogananda's, but this was the one of the few that I came back to every year that catalyzed me. And, I had a weird experience, and I read about some of these in my very first book, which was called Zen Entrepreneurship. And so that's a little bit about the double life that I was talking about. So some of those experiences. But there was one experience where, I had a dream about a competitor. And at that point, I had been meditating regularly, and I had a dream that morning, and I hadn't heard from this competitor in over a year. We thought maybe he went out of business, and I just thought that was odd. Why am I having a dream about this competitor? I've never, had a dream about him before. And I went in the office that day, and I got a call from IBM, which was kind of the big company in our space. And they told me that they were going to release a competitor to our product, but they wanted to give me a call before they announced it to the public, just as a courtesy, since we're partners with them. And I was like, how come I haven't heard of this product before? And they said, oh, we bought that competitor of yours like a year ago, and today is when we're going to do the announcement. And so, experiences like that, I had the dream in the morning, the call came afterwards, right? Pseudo precognitive, but that showed that there's more going on that meets the eye, right? And that's what a lot of Yogananda's book is about, is that there's more going on than meets the eye. And that's what got me deeper and deeper into spirituality. So that was a little more answering your first question, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I love it all, right? Like I love Yogananda's book. I love how you're just able to put things in perspective for myself. So going back to Yogananda's book, like how much do you think it is mystical stories, and how much of it is metaphor for how to live, like, to your point, living in practicing yoga, right? And I think it's your quote that says, is the cessation of the whirlpools of thought and feeling in the river of consciousness, right? So how much of this book is actually like mystical stories, and how much of it is applying like the yoga techniques kind of thing?
How much of my book, or of Yogananda's book?
Of Yogananda's book.
Yeah, well, I think it's a mixture of both, right? He's hiding the lessons about applying this stuff to your own life inside these stories. And the thing that makes the stories so memorable are these seemingly impossible events, right? And I'll tell you one of the stories in the book that some of your listeners may know or not know, but it's one of the stories that I remembered without having to reread it. It was of this guy who a yogi helped him when he was younger, or he helped a yogi, and the yogi taught him basically to be able to control an invisible entity, right? What we might call like a genie. Or jinn in the Muslim Islamic traditions, and this guy was an Islamic fakir, which is kind of like their version of a holy man, or a sadhu, which is more the Hindu term for spiritual seeker. And he was able to get this entity, this genie, let's call him, and his name was Hazrat, to like take objects and make them disappear, and then bring them to him. And he ended up misusing the power, right? He would use it to say, touch some gold jewelry, then he'd walk away, and then he'd tell Hazrat to go get it for him. And so he was using it for personal gain, and the jewelry would disappear, but not while he was there. So nobody could call him on it, right? And this seems like a pretty miraculous story. Modern seekers would be like, hey, is this really was this a real story? Did Yogananda make this up? And, he goes to great pains to tell us how he heard the story. It was from his guru. His name is Sri Yukteswar, who saw and actually met this guy whose name was Afzal Khan, and said he witnessed him, generating gold plates and an entire meal, right there in the room where Yogananda stood out of nowhere, and then them all kind of disappearing afterwards. But then at the end, the guy, Afzal Khan, had to publish something in the newspaper saying, a kind of a mea culpa, saying, I'm sorry. What happened was I tried to steal this gold ball from an old man. He turned out to be the same yogi who taught me this technique. And he said, it's true, you're misusing this power. And so he took away the ability to control this genie. And so I'm writing this to tell everybody my story. Now, whether it was true or not, there's a real important lesson here, right? Which is about this guy supposedly had some karmic tendencies where in the previous lives, where he was avaricious, he was greedy, right? He wanted things. And so if you had a tendency to be greedy, what better test for you than to have a genie be able to get you anything you wanted from the physical world at any time to see if you would misuse it. And so there's a karmic element to these stories. And so it's a colorful way to remember that lesson. So like I like to say, that's a karmic lesson, but it's also a lesson about how we apply these things, in our own lives. And so I would say, the book is a mixture of the stories, and Yogananda usually mentions the messages sort of towards the end, but because the stories are so fun and colorful, we kind of lose track of that, or we don't think about it because we move on to the next great story while we're reading the book. Another great story was the Tiger Swami. Mm-hmm. Right, which many people remember. It was this guy who taught himself to fight tigers, Bengal tigers. If you've ever seen these tigers, that's with his bare hands. That's not an easy thing to do. It's kind of a crazy thing to do, right? I mean, who would want to do that? Well, this guy did, and he became famous for it. And then he was given a warning by a Swami saying, okay, you should stop fighting tigers. You should start, turning into a monk and meditate and work on yourself. And of course, he was relatively young at the time, still at the height of his career. And he's like, I don't want to do that. I'm going to keep, fighting tigers. And there was a Raj, kind of like a prince, who had a new Bengal tiger. And he said, look, if you fight and you're able to beat him, I'll give you all this money and I'll do all that. And he said, okay, I'll do it. And turns out this tiger was the one that really stopped the Tiger Swami, because he mauled him. I mean, the Tiger Swami won the fight, but he had lost so much blood that at that point he was, spent 6 months basically laying down recovering. And when he came back, finally, to good health, he had no desire to fight tigers anymore. It was almost like the desire had been extinguished in him. And then he went to that Swami and he began to work on his inner tigers, which are like doubt, ignorance, and the kinds of things that yoga practices are meant to resolve. Now, the obvious lesson there is focus on your inner tigers, not on the outer tigers. But I think there's a more important lesson, and you have to kind of think about the story and before you get there. And this is what I try to do with my book, is kind of draw this out. And I've even had monks at the Self-Realization Fellowship, which is Yogananda's organization. I was just in LA like a few weeks ago, and tell me they love this book because it gives them the ability to not just revisit the lessons, but to really, the stories, but to think about the stories, about what are they really teaching us. And in this case, I think it's teaching us something else as well as that lesson, which is that sometimes we spend too much time fighting our outer tigers, but those outer tigers are part of our karma. They may be part of our story, right? And if we were in a video game, you choose a character and you'd have a storyline and you'd have a set of quests and achievements. Our karma are the things that we are drawn to that nobody else is drawn to, like this guy. The fact that he was drawn to fighting tigers, right? That's not something everybody does. The fact that, I was drawn to be a writer, even at an early age, even though I was going to be a computer entrepreneur, it was sort of part of my path. And so I feel like, we get out there and we fight. It's okay for us to fight our outer tigers and to go out in the world and do these battles, but we also then need to be complement. And I had a similar experience in my own life where I was out in the business world and kind of at the height of my success, right? I had sold a company for millions of dollars. I was an investor in companies like Discord, which did quite well, which everybody uses Discord now. Not many people know it was a video game company. And, I was there when the guy started it and given him a little money to get going.
Wow.
And I was at MIT teaching about startups for a startup program. And then, I ended up having like a physical issue. I had a health issue where I ended up having to get heart surgery. And I talk about this in the book. And I view that as my outer tiger's moment, right? It wasn't that I wasn't supposed to be an entrepreneur and be successful. It's that at some point I knew that I would start to be a writer in my career, but I was continuing to be out in the business world and doing all these things when part of my story, my script in this life, if you had asked me when I was a kid, just like with Yogananda, he had glimpses that he would be a wandering monk. He got the location wrong. He thought he'd be wandering out the Himalayas. In fact, he was wandering around the U.S. in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. He basically crisscrossed the country with automobiles were relatively new back then, and on trains. Of course, he didn't have planes. That plane traffic was not very common back then. But he was one of the most traveled monks of all time, just crisscrossing the country back then. And so, my outer tiger moment also came where I was basically stuck on a couch for many months, and I had to really think about priorities. And I realized, here I am out there in the business world trying to raise a venture capital fund. I'm, doing all this stuff that they do in Silicon Valley, but really my heart wanted to write books. And I knew that was a key part of my plan. And I ended up publishing 2 books within those 9 months because that's about all I could do, right? During that time, I couldn't really do, every time I tried to go jump back in the Silicon Valley world, I would get, I would have health issues and end up back in the hospital. But I could easily take an Uber to Starbucks and sit down and write these books that I'd been meaning to write. And of course, that's where my best-selling book, The Simulation Hypothesis, came from during that time. And since then, I've been much more focused on my writing and doing other things. But it kind of helps us. Sometimes we get a course correction, and that course correction helps us get back on a path that perhaps we were meant to be on. So anyway, those are some examples from the book and from my book and some of the lessons from Yogananda's book.
That's good stuff. There's so many things I want to ask you right now, right? Especially with the simulation hypothesis. I mean, Yogananda speaks about this being a movie almost, right? Like back in the day, what he talks about, the film and the projector and all that, right? Now it's more like the simulation, the video game, the VR, virtual reality. Do you think we suffer, right? Like, and just thinking about the simulation hypothesis, do you think suffering comes about because we are so attached to this virtual reality that we, is this Maya? Is this an illusion? Our suffering derives from this, our buy-in, our concentration into this dream.
Well, I think it's something like that. And the reason why I was asked to write this book was partly because of my previous work in tying simulation theory to Eastern mystics. And I quoted Yogananda, who talks about life and death are like doorways between one dream and another, right? And so, as you mentioned, Yogananda used the analogy of the movie projector. And this was important to him. And he came to that from asking a similar question to what you're just asking now, which is he saw the newsreels, right? Back then, they didn't have TVs. They had radios, but they had these newsreels where you'd go to the theater, the cinema, and you'd see like these newsreels from World War I. And of course, they didn't call it World War I back then because they didn't have a second one.
It was the war.
It was the Great War. Yeah, it was like the Great War. And you know why? Because it was the first war where mechanized ammunition and guns were used. And so the level of death was well beyond what had been done with previous wars. And so Yogananda saw this suffering and even had visions of it, of what it was like, where he was, kind of transported, and he saw himself as a German soldier getting shot by a bullet, and he fell into the water, and he really thought he was dead. And so not only did he have visions, but he also saw the suffering on these newsreels, and he would ask, Lord, why do you allow such suffering? And that was when he got this message very clearly, right? That what are life and death but relativities in the cosmic dream, and that what you're seeing play out. He uses a specific word, and I honestly didn't know what this word meant, so I had to look it up. He says what you're seeing play out in France, right, which is where the most of the killing in the Western Front, right, in World War I was, is a play of chiaroscuro, and that's an Italian word. I had to look it up, and it actually is a type of artwork that is about shadow and light, right? And he said basically he got this message that the world is like a movie, and that it looks like the people in the movie are suffering. And of course, the characters are, but the actors aren't, right? The actors aren't dying for real in the movie. They're playing a part, right? And in fact, if you look at like many of the Oscar roles that people have won Oscars for, actors have won Oscars, it's for playing roles of someone who went through great suffering. And so, perhaps, and Yogananda himself says, suffering is part of this world, right? Ceaseless joy is not the nature of this world. That's like an exact quote, right? But he also says that if you look at modern science, modern science is telling us that basically that there is no material world, right? He says the warp and woof of the material world are Maya, right? They are part of an illusion. Now, Maya gets translated as illusion, and that's what most of us use. But if you look into it, it really means something like a carefully crafted illusion, right? Meaning you agree, in a sense, to the illusion. And a good analogy that I've heard, used by scholars is if you're looking at a magic show, right, on a stage, right? The guy's not really doing real magic, right? These are tricks, but you go there to be fooled, because when he saws that woman in half and then puts her back together, right, you're like, whoa, right? And so you almost play a part in the illusion, and part of that illusion is the suffering, right? I mean, if you've ever been to a movie, and I used to go to movies when I was a kid, and every now and then I'd look away from the screen, and of course I'd look at everybody else and I'd see how involved they were, right, eating our popcorn in the movie. But then I'd also notice this flash of light, which is, of course, the frames. I mean, if you just watch the movie, you don't realize they're frames, right? But if you can see kind of the difference in the light and dark of the movie projector. And so Yogananda liked to use the latest scientific concepts and the latest technology analogy. And he would try to tell his students, look away from the screen, look towards the light. And that's part of what yoga is to remind us that there is light, that the world is made of light. Now, that's just one analogy. The analogy of the dream has been used since time immemorial, right? The Buddhists, in particular, use this idea that the world is like a dream. In fact, the name Buddha means, right? A woman asked him after he became enlightened, what are you? And he said, I am But, using the Sanskrit word, which means awake, right? So Buddha means I am awake, which means that everybody else is asleep, right? And so the dream metaphor is a powerful one that's been used for the physical world. But Yogananda updated it to the latest technology of his time, which was movies and projectors. And if he were alive today, I do think, honestly, that he would do the same thing. He would update it and he would say, it's like a movie, but it's an interactive movie, and we're all actors, right? And we can change our parts. We have some free will. It's like an interactive video game, right? Is I think the right analogy for people to understand, this play. And there's a term called the Leela, which is from the Vedas from 5,000 years ago, where they talk about the play of the gods, or the divine play. And of course, Shakespeare used the famous line of the stage play, where the world's a stage and the men and women are merely players, right? And then players is a term for actors, right? But I like that it ties to this idea of play, because when I was at the MIT Game Lab, one of the professors used to say that one of the oldest forms of human behavior is playing, right? It's socialize. That's how you learn to socialize as a kid. You play games with other people, and so this metaphor of the game of life. But to enjoy the game fully, you have to kind of forget that you're playing a game, right? And so that's where you go through the ups and downs of the emotions of life. But if you play the game enough times, you start to realize, okay, this is just a game, and perhaps we shouldn't be so attached to this roll of the dice. Have you ever seen that game, Chutes and Ladders?
Yeah, sure.
Right, that's a Western version of an Indian, South Asian game, which has snakes and ladders. And I remember this as a kid, like a little kid. I remember like my cousins playing it. But if you go back to that game, Snakes and Ladders, it was actually called the Leela, which is the exact same term as the divine play. And as you like roll the dice and you moved up and then you went down, these were all supposed to be like the random elements of the physical world and karma. And eventually the top row was supposed to be like an area of enlightenment that you reach. So it was basically trying to simulate this whole, well, I used to play what's called the game of life, right? A board game where you have a
Sure.
character and you go around the board, and it turns out it was something like that originally. It was put together by some spiritual guys who were trying to show what the world is like it's a game, and it's not just in the Hindu traditions. Recently I went to the UK this summer and I spoke at a conference on Islam and the simulation hypothesis. That's what my speech was on. It was a conference about other Islamic stuff, and we had like guys like an Ayatollah from Iran there and other things, and and I was quoting verses from the Quran which say that this whole world is like a game, a sport, a pastime that we have set up for you. And so to experience, to multiply your riches, right? Like if you think of the game of life or Monopoly, or Risk, right? This is kind of the stuff that we're doing. We lose ourselves in the game. And so I think we do lose ourselves in the game. And I think that's okay to a certain extent. But then there becomes a point at which we're like, okay, am I just doing the same game over and over again? What were the things that I really wanted to do? I'd forgotten before. Have you ever had that
Sure.
experience where
Mm-hmm.
before playing a video game or a game, you're like, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and then you completely forget while you're in there because you're too busy playing the game.
Absolutely. Yeah. Have you ever had, oh, man, there's so many questions. Every time you talk, I feel like I just want to ask a million questions. Who's the original creator, right? The original designer, like even at MIT, when you were, designing these games, you were the designer, the coder for this, right? Like who is the original coder for this simulation or this game?
Well, that's the big question.
I know, man. I know,
Everyone asks, right? And so I think there's different answers that different people give, right? I mean, Yogananda would say it's God, right? Because he was using religious terminology, right? And he was also trying to link the Hindu yogic traditions with the Christian traditions because he was living and teaching in America, which was primarily a Christian nation, and we didn't know much about yoga or Eastern mystics beyond a few stereotypes of naked yogis in the Himalayas doing weird stuff, right? Navel gazing and stuff, right? And he came in the 20s, so it was a good time because in the 20s, after the war, things started to open up and people were more open-minded. Some people think it's a future civilization, right? That is doing what we call an ancestor simulation. There was a professor at Oxford named Nick Bostrom who really got the simulation idea going a couple decades ago now in 2003, a few years after the Matrix came out. And he coined this term of an ancestor simulation, which is basically that we are simulating our ancestors. So like if we were to simulate ancient Rome, right, or ancient India or ancient Egypt inside a very realistic video game. There's a great movie that came out in the same year as The Matrix. Not that many people have seen it, but it's called The 13th Floor. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
No.
It was based on a sci-fi book from the 60s called Simulacron 3. But basically in that movie, which came out in 99, they were in the 90s and they had created this kind of very holographic representation. They're in LA, so of LA in the 1940s or maybe it was late 30s. And so this guy would go into the simulation and take over the body of a character, and everybody was realistic and they thought they were living real lives, but they were in the 1930s or 1940s. And that's like an example of an ancestor simulation. I'll give away the big reveal because it's a 20-year-old movie and it's like The Matrix, so most people know. But when he came back to the 90s, he also realized eventually that 90s was actually a simulation too, and it was a simulation from a future civilization, let's say the 2020s or 2050s, right?
Sure.
And so that's another potential answer. I like to think it's us, right? In the sense that if we're putting on a virtual reality helmet, then we've made the choice, right, to put on that helmet and kind of forget about what's going on, and so we are part. Like there are games where you can help design levels, right? Through mods in video games, right? And you can choose quests and achievements, right? So I almost feel like we are like architects of our story in the game. And then we're like, okay, this could be interesting. If I did this and I had this choice and maybe I went there or maybe I did this, and then maybe something threw me off, right? And then you say, okay, now I'm going to experience this great script that I've written. And I'm going to see if I even remember the script once I get into the game. And so, I think and that's where we get into perhaps one of the important questions in simulation theory, which is the NPC versus RPG version.
Mm.
And NPC stands for non-player character, where everybody's simulated. RPG stands for role-playing game, where you exist outside of the game, and then you have a character inside the game. So you're not just AI in the simulation. Your character is controlled by you. Your avatar, that's the term that is used in video games for your character. And that's an ancient Sanskrit term as well, that meant divinity descending down into a body. And the guys over at Star Wars, at Lucasfilm, when they were building the first kind of multiplayer role-playing game on the old Commodore 64 using dial-up modems, they wanted a little term for that little guy that they only had it was like 8-bit characters, and they decided to call it an avatar because it was like descending through the phone lines and modems from your Commodore 64. And it's interesting how it ties to this idea. But and then there's those who say, well, it's your soul that is outside, right? So it's you, but it's your soul, and then this is your body that you're inhabiting. So I tend to take that view that we exist outside of the simulation as entities, and that's where our consciousness comes from. But while we're here, we choose to forget. And so we are architects of the simulation. We're not necessarily the creators. Whoever the creator is, we would think of almost as God, or a type of God, if you will, right? And there's many variations you can take on that idea. But I tend to think it's more that, and not we're just NPCs or AI that once the game is off, we go away and that's it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Speaking of avatars, right? Like I have to talk about this. Babaji, right? Never really heard of him before this book. And then now it seems like I can't stop seeing his name everywhere, right? And I don't know if Yogananda had a big part in that. I'm sure he did, right? But he is this mystical saint in the book, right? That basically brings Kriya Yoga back to humanity, which is a direct line to enlightenment. Have you ever had like mystical experiences, or had any type of experiences with Babaji or Yogananda?
Well, so Babaji, before we get into my own experiences, he's presented in the autobiography as the deathless guru, right? So he's a guy who is living in the Himalayas, which is a cold place, right? Basically in a loincloth, and he's lived supposedly hundreds of years, right? And so Yogananda, according to him, and he's referred to as the Maha Avatar Babaji these days, which was a terminology that Yogananda kind of brought to the West. And turns out in India now, they also use that terminology, even though he kind of, wrote it here. Maha Avatar just means great avatar. And supposedly in 1860, Yogananda's guru's guru, a guy named Lahiri Mahashai, who was living in Benares, he was like a clerk in the, I don't know, like the government, right? And he was called to some post in the remote Himalayas. And he was wandering around, and he met this guy in 1860 who said, "Don't you remember me?" Right? He goes, "I remember you, Lahiri. I've been waiting for you for 30 years, and I decided not to come to you earlier because I wanted you to get married and have kids and know what it was like to live what we would call a modern life, what they called a householder life, as opposed to going into a monastery and becoming like a swami where you didn't have any of the experience of the world." This is really relevant to the fact that Yogananda was an advocate of being in the world and how to bring yoga in. And he ruffled a lot of traditionalist feathers, by the way, because yoga, these kind of yogic techniques were taught guru to disciple and required initiation, and right. And he was out, teaching to crowds that were like thousands. There are pictures of him in these large halls with teaching to thousands of people. And so anyway, already at that point in time, theoretically, Babaji had been around for hundreds of years, right? He was supposedly part of the mentor to Kabir, who was a 15th century Muslim Hindu poet, scholar, yogi, who pissed off the Hindus and the Muslims because he said, "You guys are all off doing your rituals, but this is what's essential, and you should be doing this." And so Yogananda's book has stories of this guy, and he's talked about a lot now. Like you said, like if you start to notice this. And the Beatles cover for their album, was it Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Band, right? You can look and there's a picture of
No
Babaji there
way.
as
I
well.
didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, it's there actually. As well as some of the other of Yogananda's gurus in that line. But most scholars would say, well, it's because Yogananda's book was so popular that people had been talking about Babaji, right? And so, one of the questions that I asked as a modern seeker is, first of all, is this possible? Right, that somebody could live that long and still be young, right? So, I mean, and then secondly, has anyone else heard of Babaji, right, or claimed to have met him? And so, for the first, answer, there are many stories in India of saints living hundreds of years, some of which are reasonably well known. Like there's a guy named Tralanga Swami, who was a 300-pound guy who walked around Benares naked, and he was supposedly 300 years old, and he died in 1898, and he'd been around since the 1600s. And there are a lot of guys like that in these traditions. And so, the stories are prevalent. And Yogananda himself says that his guru met him many times, right? And Yogananda himself says that before he left India, by the way, he couldn't leave right away. He took the very first boat out of India after the Great War, after World War One, to come to Boston to do a speech at a religious conference from different religions. And so he says he saw him in the flesh, right, at that point in time, and he looked exactly like he described, and he smelled flowers before he saw him, which is something other people have described as well. And so I looked into the traditions and said, most people who talk about Babaji got it from Yogananda, but there are other traditions that also talk about this guy Babaji, that they have met him in person. There's another guy called Sri M who says that he met his guru, who he called Babaji, but it wasn't the same. It was a disciple of who Yogananda calls Babaji. His name
Yeah,
was
he has some
Maher.
crazy stories too.
He
Not that
did, yeah.
crazy, but obviously, if you read them, right? I'm reading his autobiography as well, and it seems
Oh,
like
yeah.
it's very unique, right? It's very mystical.
Yeah.
It's like it takes you like a Western mindset. It basically goes against everything that we've been brought up to think, right? As far as like an objective reality, like these guys are doing things that are against the rules of physics. You know what I mean? Like
Right,
it's
right.
crazy.
Yeah, and if you think of physics like a game engine, that's like every video. When we build video games, we have a physics engine, right? That's one of the things we incorporate, and these are the rules, and you specify the parameters, and then in every game, you specify whether your avatar can fly, whether you can teleport. But then you hear stories from Yogananda of people doing this kind of thing, and turns out you also hear stories in other traditions. I interviewed a Catholic professor named Diana Pasoka, who wrote a really well-known book called American Cosmic about UFOs and religion and technology. And she's, Catholic tradition, like that's what she's been studying. And she went to the Vatican and looked at the canonization records of Joseph of Cupertino. And what that means is she saw the devil's advocate's testimony, right? And what is the devil's advocate? That is the guy that the church assigns when somebody says they saw a miracle. The church assigns this guy to disprove it, right? So this guy was trying to prove, come on, this guy never flew. This didn't happen, right? But she saw there were like 1,000 signatures of people in the square in Cupertino, which I think is in Spain or someplace in Europe, or maybe it's Portugal. But he was floating up in the square in front of everybody, like way back when this happened. And that kind of convinced her that these things are possible. So to answer your question, your other question about my own personal experiences. I mean, I had an interesting experience with Yogananda, which is a vision, not in the flesh. He died in 1952, I think it was, or 54. He died before his book became. I mean, it was starting to become popular, but it was in the 60s that his book really took off and was passed around. And so during the writing of this book, one of the lessons in the book is lesson number 9, like go for little and small pilgrimages whenever you can. And so I was trying to write this book and get started, and I wanted some inspiration. So I decided to go on a little pilgrimage to where Yogananda wrote his book. It was in Encinitas, which is just north of San Diego. And there's a hermitage there where he lived during, much of the last decade of his life. And it was there that he wrote this book, and he would write things in paper, and then his editor, would type them up. And the only problem was, it was during COVID, and they had closed it off to the public, right? So, but I didn't want to go all the way down there without being able to go in. And so it turns out the SRF, the group, his group that runs it, actually gave me a private tour and opened it up for me. And so that's what I knew I was on the right track, right? When these things just kind of open up like that. And I got to spend as much time as I wanted in that room, which is preserved. His office is preserved. And the office has these French doors that look out over the Pacific Ocean. And while I was there, I naturally got into a meditative state. I mean, you have the waves of the ocean, below the cliffs coming through. If the doors are open, you can feel the breeze. I think the doors were closed. But they say this is not uncommon if people are there in silence. They feel that energy of Yogananda, and I got into meditation. And I had a vision of him that came through pretty strong for me, where he was standing there with a bunch of papers, like a stack of papers, right? Of course, back then they didn't have computers. And so that was like a novel. And he kind of looked, and in my vision, he kind of looked at me kind of mischievously. He opened the French doors out to the ocean. And much to my horror as an author, right? I'm an author and a writer. He took these stack of papers and he tossed them out over the Pacific Ocean. And they went flying every which way. And, there's a famous scene from a movie in India by an Indian director, which was pretty popular in the West, in the art film scene. Like, most people don't know it in the mainstream, where this guy had this manuscript he's been carrying around for years, his life's work, and he threw it away, and then it was gone. And so I was horrified. But then, Yogananda kind of looks at me with a mischievous smile, and he goes, "Look." And I looked at the papers, and each of them turned into little birds, and they went off, to all these different parts of the world, carrying his words everywhere. And for me, that was a message. Right? Now, you could say that's a subjective vision, and I'm fine with that, right? It was a subjective vision for me as a writer, trying to get inspiration for writing this book, right? But it was very uncanny, like the realism of that particular scene and what happened with it in that moment in time. So, that's sort of more of a direct experience that I would say. And many people claim to have had these types of visions and experiences related to Yogananda and related to Babaji as well.
Man, that's such a beautiful story. I read that and I immediately connected with it, because there's been many times where I've actually, said a silent prayer to Yogananda or Babaji or some of the other saints, right? And feel like a deep connection that I feel a deep connection to, like, and I'll have subjective experiences, and that's all that matters, really, right? Like, why do I want to measure that, right? Like, how does it affect my direct reality? That's all I care about, really, right? Like,
Right.
and for you, right? Like that vision and seeing that as a writer, right? Like that had significance for you and what you were doing at the time. And I'm sure there were signs tied with that as far as where you were at in your path. But I think, their energy is just in these different locations. Like, you talk about samadhi, right? Like, can you talk about a little bit what samadhi is? And then I've heard of instances of where, like, people's samadhis still reside, right? Like, what
Yeah, I
is
mean,
that?
Yogananda was a big fan of going to places where saints either were living now or in the past, right? And going to temples that were set up by specific saints. At one point, he finally made it to the Himalayas in Kashmir, which is, the mountainous region that kind of borders. Today, it's like on the border of India and Pakistan. Back then, it was all India. And he went to a temple in the mountains of a guy named Adi Shankara, who was like an 8th or 9th century Swami, who reorganized the whole Swami order, of which Yogananda was a part of. And in that, they stopped at this temple, and it's beautiful mountain scene, right? He called Kashmir the most beautiful place he's ever been, right? And there he went into a meditative state, and he often took the time to stop and meditate in different places, whether they were scenes of natural beauty or there were places where a saint lived, right? And this is kind of a South Asian tradition, but it's also present in other parts of the world. The saints, the Catholic saints, have this as well, that you can get healing from these places, or you can get insight, or you can connect to where a very spiritual person was living for a period of time. And there while he was meditating, he had a vision of a building on top of a hill that he didn't recognize. Until like many years later, he was in America in Los Angeles, and he saw this building that was it was an old hotel that wasn't being used anymore. And he ended up, even though he didn't have a lot of money, I mean, Yogananda, you read his book and you think, oh, his life was just magical. Everything just happened easily. But the more you study his life and biography, you realize he had tons of difficulties. But one of them was money, right? He didn't have the money. But he scraped together what he could and got a mortgage. And you can read his letters, and he's always like, we got to make the mortgage payment. But this was the building he saw, and that is a beautiful place on top of Mount Washington in Los Angeles. And that came about partly because he recognized, when he saw it, he recognized it from his vision in Kashmir, right? And so I believe we get clues. So not only was he connecting to Shankara in a mountain temple in India, and Shankara was probably one of the most well-traveled monks of his generation in India in the 8th or 9th century, whenever he lived. And of course, he just walked or took horses right back then. Yogananda was one of the most well-traveled monks of his day, and he took trains, as we talked about before, in the modern world. But he also he had a mission to bring yoga from the east to the west. And Shankara had a mission to reorganize yoga right within India itself at that point. Mm-hmm. And so that's an example of, I think, where you can go to where a spiritual person was. And that's why people go on pilgrimages, sure. I was raised in the Muslim tradition, and everyone goes to Mecca, where they try to. And, I went as a kid. We lived in Saudi Arabia. We drove across the desert, and there's like all these people there. And, that's that's what I would call a big pilgrimage back in the day. But Yogananda was a fan, and he took big pilgrimages. He went to the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and other places, but he took little pilgrimages to temples or sites of beauty or places where saints lived. And that was a cue that I got from him. And I often do that as well. So I encourage people to do that.
Sure. You talk about Yogananda having financial difficulties, but being able to see visions and bring some of those buildings into his reality, right? Especially over on the West Coast in LA, he has that site. Do you think it is that we can bring things into our reality through will, through manifestation, through reprogramming the game? Like, how does that work for us, right?
Well, I think there's two ways to think of this, right? One way is about manifesting something, right? Which is that you are creating something. But there's another way, which I think is at work. And I think you have to do both, right? The other way is sensing something that is already there, and then navigating from one of multiple realities towards that reality. You still have to make those decisions, right? And in quantum mechanics, there's this idea of multiple possible futures, right, that are sending information through time to us. And in a sense, by making choices and noticing things in our minds, we're choosing one of those futures, right? And so I would say that when he saw not just that building, but he saw several other buildings, when he was younger, he was a young Swami. He was running a school for boys, and he had just become Swami Yogananda a few years earlier. He was in his 20s at the time, and he didn't have much of a place to meditate, right? It was like the school with a ton of like boys running around, and he had a little space behind a box in the shed that he would use to meditate to get away from the noise. And there he had a vision of these, what looked like Caucasian faces. And he assumed they were Americans. He had never met an American before, right? But to him, that was a vision of something that he took to mean, okay, means that I should be going to America. And he had some conversations about this in the past, but he wasn't the best guy to go speak at this religious conference. I mean, if you're going to have one guy from India, you wouldn't choose a young Swami in his 20s who rarely ever has given speech to anyone except for these kids, and never had given a speech in English. Think about that, right? And yet he caught whiff through these visions by quieting his mind. His intuition caught a whiff of a possible future that perhaps was laid out for him. I'm not going to go so far as to say that is his only possible future, right? He could have chosen not to go, but we wouldn't be talking about him today, because he came and lived here for 35 years, till he died, basically.
Mhm.
And so I think there's another way, is that sometimes we are sensing things and we can pay attention. And he said that when the mind is calm, man unlocks his intuition, right? And that the divine, meaning whatever is sending him these intuitions, has an answer. He said, even though man's capability to get into trouble is endless, right? So too is the capability of the divine to send him messages on how to get out of those troubles, right? And so I think there's an element of that going on here as well. And, he also took charge and did things. So it's like, you have to do both, right? Like when he went back to India in 1935 for a visit, that school that he had where he had been running and he had been having the vision, the land was going to be taken over, and he needed to raise money. And he's like, well, I didn't spend all this time in America to not have a can-do attitude, right? Because a lot of Indians at the time, that's just karma, whatever, it's gone. He said, no, I'm going to step up, right? I'm going to step up and go raise the money the same way that I had to in America. And then they raised enough money to buy the land so that the school could continue. And so, it's a combination of sensing where the future might be and using that intuition, to help guide you along the way. It could be a little thing, right? It could be a feeling of deja vu, like, okay, have you seen this before, right? I'll give you a really simple example, not quite as dramatic as Yogananda seeing his entire building. But when I moved to Silicon Valley in 2007, I was walking in downtown Mountain View, which is, where I lived for a while. Actually, this is where I am right now, right down the road from Google. And there's this one tall building, right? Every other building is like 1 or 2 stories. And every time I walk by this building, I had this funny feeling that, I should have an office there, or I will have an office there, or something. Like I couldn't quite place it, but it was like this sense of familiarity. And I'd never even been in the building, to be honest with you, right? But every time I walked by it, I had this funny feeling. And then later, when we built our video game company, that was the #1 game in the App Store, which we sold to a big Japanese game company. We ended up having an office in that building, and I almost like to view it as an echo from the future, right? It wasn't that we had to have an office in that building. It was more like that was a possible future that was calling out to me, and that I was sensing, and that the more that we calm our minds, the more that we, help still the vrittis, which is the Sanskrit word that's used in the ancient Yoga Sutra that defines what yoga is, right? They don't define yoga as the asanas, which is the physical postures. They have the 8 limbs of yoga, but the actual definition is, with the new translation that I put into this book, or new interpretation, I'd say, which is that it is the stilling or the cessation of the whirlpools of thoughts and feelings. And that's what the vrittis are. They are whirlpools of thought and desire and anger and hate, all of this stuff, and attachment, and whirlpools have to be in something. So I said, well, in the river of consciousness, right? And so yoga helps you still all those. And when it does, I feel like we can sense these different paths that we might want to take. And sometimes, it's frustrating because it doesn't happen right away. But yeah, I think that's one of the ways we can sense what's happening, and that's how we can help manifest, something that we want, but something also I think that is aligned with our mission. Right? Sometimes you read Yogananda's book and you think, he asked for something and Divine Mother just gives it to him, right? Okay, maybe that's fine for him, but not for us. But what you'll notice is usually his prayers are granted when it is related to his mission in life and his karma, right? And whether it's convincing his sister-in-law's husband, who's a big materialist, and telling him he's a foolish little monk for like putting on these robes and becoming a dirty yogi when he should be getting a job and supporting himself and making money in the real world. And he went to this temple to try to, with his sister, try to convince this guy to be more spiritual. But instead of doing anything, he just sat there and meditated to Divine Mother, which is like the feminine energy, right? For which is expressed in various traditions. And then a kind of a mini thing happened where they were supposed to arrange for their lunch and they didn't. And there was a strict policy that said, if you didn't arrange for lunch beforehand, we're not going to, you can't get it here. And his brother-in-law said, see, you stupid monk, you spent the whole morning meditating when, we should have been out arranging for our lunch. Now we're going to starve for the rest of the day because now the temple's closed and there's nothing we can do. Well, it turns out another monk in the temple saw Yogananda meditating, and he said, "Oh, I saw you meditating, and somehow, heard your thoughts, and we decided to make an exception to our rules and give you, arrange lunch for you guys." And this isn't about lunch, right? He was asking for a way to convince his brother-in-law, and in the end, he ended up convincing his brother-in-law because his brother-in-law was shocked because he said, "Divine Mother's not going to give you lunch," and turns out she did in that case, right? But we can read those stories and say, well, Yogananda gets whatever he prays for. Well, it's not that simple, right? It's not that simple. He had a huge setback in America. And this is part of the lesson, setbacks sometimes are part of your story, right? And at one point, his second in command, Swami Dhirananda, got into a huge scandal where the husband of one of the women studying, meditation came and like hit him on the nose, bopped him on the nose because he thought, they're chanting in these back rooms. They must be doing some weird sexual thing with my wife, right? And that story went what we would call viral today, right? It was like all the Hearst newspapers, right? Pre-internet, like the newspapers were how things went viral. And so all across the country, they were like, Swami gets, popped in the nose, and he's strange yogic love cults, are doing this and that with our women, right? And this is back in like the late 20s, early 30s. You can think back 100 years. And that eventually eventually it got to the point where he had to cancel his appearance in Miami because all the husbands of the women that wanted to attend his talks, were going to beat him up. And the police were like, no, you have to cancel this because you're going to get hurt. Right. And then that second in command, Swami Dhirananda, left, and his organization fell apart, and a bunch of people in LA that were supporting him left. And he was like, geez, this is too much work. He went to Mexico and prayed, please let me go back to India where I, can just meditate in a cave, right? I don't need all these organizational problems. And the answer was no. This is part of your mission in life. And so I think, when we ask for help, we can ask for it from some spiritual tradition that we are a part of or that we feel close to, right? But oftentimes the difference between when prayers are granted or not granted is when they somehow align with the story that we have set for ourselves in this life. They're part of our storyline, because we do suffer setbacks sometimes, but sometimes the setbacks help us. Like in my case, right? I mean, I didn't want to have a heart issue.
Yeah, who
right?
does?
That's who does, right? But it completely changed my trajectory for the last 5 years since this has happened, right? And that was almost an important part. And when I wanted to get healthy so I could go back in the business world, it didn't happen. But when I wanted enough help to be able to do my books and do the other things, then it happened. So I think it is a lesson in there for all of us from Yogananda's life. In addition to his book, sometimes you have to look at what happened in his life as well.
So funny, right? Like metaphorically, if you think about that, right? Like you weren't following your heart, and what happened? Your heart was hardly working, right? Like it was failing
Yeah,
essentially. And then
that's right.
it wasn't until you followed your heart that, you started lighting back up.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to put it, because my heart at that point wasn't in, but I was doing the things because you get brainwashed wherever you are, right? Whatever industry you're in. And I lived in Silicon Valley where it's all about, go public, Google, invest in the next big thing, build, be the next Twitter, be the next Facebook, right? There's all this kind of stuff. And when you're in that ecosystem, and for me, it's not that wasn't part of my path. It's like the Tiger Swami. I spent too much time on that, right? I should have been happy once I, sold my company, made a lot of money. I even said, that's it. No more companies for me. It's too stressful, right? And yet I ended up getting back into the business in a different way, which was in venture capital. But still, it was like, well, maybe there's other aspects of my personality here, which my heart is longing for. And then it kind of, the course correction didn't give me a lot of choice, right? In getting back on the path. So yeah, I think that's a great way to express it.
What is like right now, right? Like, are you initiated in Kriya Yoga? Do you mind me asking? Like, is there a meditation that you practice? Do you have a guru?
Well, I don't have a specific guru these days, but Yogananda is probably the closest to a guru that I would say. But I also have learned a lot of techniques over the years, and I've kind of combined them. So it's a Kriya Yoga light technique, which deals with moving energy up the spine and meditating on the chakras and stuff. And this is the thing about Yogananda, like some of the people that I mentioned that were such huge fans of the book, like Steve Jobs or George, they learned different types of meditation from different gurus, right? They weren't necessarily part of SRF, right, or that lineage necessarily. They were inspired by Yogananda to go start on the spiritual path, and that's what I think his big impact. So, by the way, after his setback, and he got that message that said, okay, no, don't go back to India. He started to look for a different way to get his message out. And then he spent the next decade writing this book, right? Rather than crisscrossing the country, he spent it in Encinitas, the same place that I went, the same office where I had the vision. He spent a good part of that decade there writing this book. And that became his legacy, right? He thought his legacy was going to be all the courses that he taught. It was, I mean, yes, and it was in terms of, his teachings, but it was the book really that made the impact for him. And that's why for me, like his story has resonated, and particularly the images of the birds carrying the words, because for me, that's sort of a very strong message that if you have limited time left in your life, which you really start to think about when you go through these kinds of health issues, what are the things you were meant to do that you perhaps haven't done yet, right? And it could be as simple as spend more time with your kids, could be, these types of things. In my case, it was my literary children, if you will, right? It was these books that that I was meant to write. Then I knew I was going to write more books, but it was like I just kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, right? Yeah.
Have you ever, and I know we're in overtime right now, have you ever experienced like gurus or teachers that maybe at that higher states of consciousness where they're hyper intuitive, or they're really tied into your energy, or whatever it can see, you know what I mean? Like how Ram Dass, when he found his guru, like he was telling him things about his mother that no one else knew. Have you ever experienced phenomena like that?
I've experienced a little bit of it in different, there's one that I write about in Zen entrepreneurship, where there's a kind of a guru figure who's based on, I mentioned there was this kind of tall Caucasian guy with blonde hair who introduced me to autobiography of yogi. In my book, I've kind of transformed him and pulled in a few different traditions that I've studied, because I've studied with Barbara Brennan, who wrote Hands of Light, who was a book all about seeing auras and energy, right? And this guy was the one who taught me about the chakra meditation technique. He's long passed on. And so there were a number of folks like that I've met. So, I think the modern yogi today, maybe less about going and finding one guru and going and spending all their time in that ashram. You can certainly choose a lineage that works for you. But what happened with me and my personal story is it's more like I got teachers. Like if you're in college, you may have an advisor, but you're going to learn from multiple professors, and then you're going to keep taking classes with the professors that you resonate with. And then you go to the more advanced classes. And so, I've met folks who can do various things, whether it's, whether it's sensing past lives, whether it's seeing energy, whether it's journeying shamanically in groups. And so I've had a lot of those, those kinds of types of experiences, but never, okay, this is the one guru that I'm going to follow the rest of my life. I'd say Yogananda has been probably one of the most, the most influential for me.
Sure. That's great. That's awesome. Yeah, that's beautiful. I never really thought about it that way. Like being a college student, having an advisor, and then going through the different courses and experiencing each professor individually, but yet coming back and having that collective education and then applying that to real life. Like that's such a great metaphor.
And think about Yogananda, right? He had his guru, Sri Yukteswar, whom he met after he graduated from high school. But most of the book is about all these other swamis and saints that he met earlier, his Sanskrit teacher, the sleepless saint, who's this guy, right? And all these stories that he would, there's the levitating saint, Baduri Mahashaya, who taught Yogananda a lot of spiritual lessons. And so if it's almost like if he hadn't had all those experiences, in addition to his eventual guru, Sri Yukteswar, right? He wouldn't have had the material for his book. Like we would probably not be talking about it today. It was because he had all the instruction from all these other guys, right? In addition to his main tradition that he followed, right? Which was the Kriya Yoga tradition of Lahiri Mahashaya. And, like that's where the richness comes in my opinion, and that added to his line. And so I think for today, I mean, today you can go on YouTube, you can watch this guru, that guru, you can read books by this guy, that guy. There's almost too much information, right?
Well,
Today.
how do you discern that, right? Like for yourself, right? Like if you're
Mm,
out here, the younger generation who is hearing a lot of this stuff, right? Like it's not uncommon for the newer aged spiritual seekers who are 20, 25, 30 to have this concept of this is a virtual reality that, I am one with God, like having these concepts, like and
yeah,
wanting to have a guru. How do you discern that information? Because YouTube is obviously exploding with the content, right? But for you,
right.
what has worked for you in past practice?
Well, what's worked for me is reading from many different people, but then learning to trust my intuition, right? That's the important part. This is why you've got to not just listen to what they say, because sometimes they'll say stuff that makes total sense, right? You also have to say, how does it make you feel afterwards? And then, go and try to meet some folks in person, even if it's a local group related to that tradition, right? You may not, nowadays you have the video of the founder online, but there are local groups for many of these groups. And SRF, there's plenty of groups related to SRF. So, in the book, I tell the story of this guy Peter, who was a Hollywood producer, and he's like, okay, I got to go to India, right, to look for a guru, and he went all the way to Rishikesh, which is the same city where like the Beatles went, back in the 60s in the very famous incident. And
Mm-hmm.
he went there and, he's walking around and, he's not really finding something. And he goes in a bookstore and he sees this picture of Yogananda in a book. And he's like, I remember that guy. He was in my Los Angeles Times newspaper. I saw a picture of him when I was a kid and I still remember that, like that picture, right? It was across time. And then he went back and he found an SRF center that was like right down the road in Hollywood, right? So he went like 10,000 miles and he came back, and that's ended up being his tradition, right? And so
Sure.
he's part of SRF and
That,
Kriyaban.
that
And
costs them a lot of time and money and flight hours. That's crazy. Like I tell people all the time, like, how do you really know? You don't really know, right? Like every education costs something. Like either it's going to cost you money, whether you're spending it in an area where you're, taking a gamble on a teacher, right? And they turn out to be a fraud. Well, guess what? Now right? Like that's part of the education. Or you fly to India to find Yogananda's book, right? And fly back. Every education costs you money, right? It's going to cost you either
it,
money, time, or energy, right? And I think
it,
that's
it
a part of the
does.
process.
And if you think of it more, like I said, like a university of life, and you say, okay, this person, maybe didn't work out, but I learned something, right? I learned something from, I mean, most of these guys or gals, right, aren't complete frauds, in my opinion, right? Most of them have something of value to teach, but they may or may not resonate with you, right? And so their tradition, because what happens with traditions is they tend to get overly formal and they tend to get very dour and very,
Sure.
whereas if you meet like guys like Yogananda, you met the original founder, they were like, funny at times. They treated the whole thing with an element
What
of
about
absurdity
anger,
as well.
right? Like I think you talked in your book or spoke to the fact that he showed anger too, right? In some of his letters.
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed a guy who wrote a biography of Yogananda, and I think it's called The Life of Yogananda, Philip Goldberg, and I asked him, what was the thing that most surprised you about Yogananda? Because I looked into it, but he wrote a whole biography just on details, and he said the thing that surprised him was how human he was. He goes both with the little things, like he liked to just play jokes on people, right? And when I was at the center on Mount Washington in LA, they were telling me about that as well. He was very playful, but he was also quick to anger, right? Sometimes he would get angry with his disciples, right? And his guru, Sri Yukteswar, was known to be very strict, right? And he would get angry with people, but then he would later, once he expressed the anger, why it was there for, then he'd go back to the loving guru, right? And so, it depends on how the anger is expressed and what it's for. If it's for something you did, and maybe sometimes you need the anger to shake you up from a habit or something, right? That's going on. But again, you have to use your intuition, right? How does it feel to you at the moment, but also later? Right, things may be great while you're there, and then later you have some reservations, like you were just being sold something, right?
Some
Like a
snake oil, yeah,
timeshare.
yeah,
Yeah, you've just been sold a
timeshare.
timeshare. Who hasn't had that experience, right? Where
It
you
used
go
to be
in and
snake
everything
oil,
is
now
great.
it's timeshares.
Now it's timeshares, right?
That's
And at the
awesome.
time, everything looks great, and then later you're like, yeah, Something's not so I'd say learn to trust your intuition.
Sure.
Intuition is soul guidance, says Yogananda, available to man in those moments where his mind is calm.
Mm, I love that. Last question, man. Riz, and I think this is going to be pretty impactful just to think about, right? If Yogananda was sitting in front of you right now, like what would you ask him?
Hmm. If he was here right now, what would I ask him? I'd probably ask him more about, when he came to America, right? Like, how did he feel during that time, right? And how did he get through the challenges, right? And he's written a little bit about this, but I find that as interesting as some of. I mean, I'd probably ask him about some of the crazy magical experiences too, because I love that stuff, right? About the jinn and about these types of yogic powers. But if I only had one question, right, I would probably ask him, how did it feel going through some of those tough times, and how did he get through, and how was he sure that he would complete his mission? Yeah.
Mm, I love it. Riz, man, thank you for taking the time. Wisdom of a Yogi. Go out and buy it right now. How can people connect with you? Where can they find your work?
So they can go to my website, which is zenentrepreneur.com, which was based on the title of my first book, Zen Entrepreneurship. And on Twitter, or I guess it's not called Twitter anymore, at Riz Stanford, just like the university, Stanford.
Awesome, man. Well, I can't thank you enough for really, I mean, just changing my perspective alone on Yogananda's work, his book, his teachings, and then finding out more about you, connecting more with you. Like I said earlier, I took this to LA with me and really deep dived there. And maybe there's an energy there too that is totally different than the East Coast, which I do believe 100% that was able, it allowed me to do a deeper dive into this and connect with it more. So thank you, my brother. I really do appreciate this.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. Glad you liked the book, and hopefully we'll chat again soon.